Everyone. Hi, today we are hosting our annual Fellowships 101. I am Christina Jackson. I'm the Deputy Director of Washington Council of Lawyers. We are a public interest bar association for the District of Columbia, committed to ensuring that our legal system treats everyone fairly, regardless of money, position, or power. Today, we are delighted to welcome you to Fellowships 101. For nearly 10 years, we have helped law students navigate the fellowship application process by hosting this panel program. We're excited to have all of you here today. If you haven't already, put your name and your law school in the chat. I'm excited to see everybody from all across the country, and I'd be interested to know what year you are. So if you want to put that in the chat as well, I would be excited to see that. We know that you're going to learn a lot today. And I also can guarantee that you're going to come away better equipped to submit a postgraduate fellowship application. Before we begin, though, I want to tell you a little bit more about Washington Council of Lawyers. We were recently named Voluntary Bar Association of the Year by the DC Bar, making it the perfect time to become a member if you're not already. We bring together public interest-minded law students and lawyers from small and big law firms, in-house legal departments, nonprofits, and government agencies. And among the many member benefits is the bi-monthly Public Interest Jobs Clearinghouse, which includes the fellowship opportunities that we're going to talk about this evening. We invite you to join our vibrant public interest community. Information about how to do that is going to be in the chat in about 2 seconds. So we hope you'll check that out. We also hope that you will check out our upcoming events. In the next month, we're going to host a best practices in pro bono, a members only discussion of post-pandemic workplaces. We're going to co-sponsor a discussion of what advocates, including the Black Lives Matter movement, actually mean when they call for defunding the police. And we're going to talk about some of the reforms being called for in DC. And that's just a few. You can register for all of our upcoming events on our website, and the link for that is also in the chat. Today, you all are going to hear from a current fellow, a host organization fellow supervisor, and 2 fellowship program coordinators who are going to discuss what makes a fellowship application attractive to funders and how to organize a successful fellowship application process. You can follow the conversation today on Twitter using #Fellow101. We are going to record today's program for anyone who registered but wasn't able to come, or if you want to go back and check in on the tips again, because we're going to talk about a lot of things today. Now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, David Steib. David is the Language Access Director at AUDA. He is a Washington Council of Lawyers board member and a former fellow, and he is going to introduce you. He's going to welcome the panel, and he's going to introduce you to our experts. So I will invite David and the rest of our panel to turn on their cameras and turn on their audio. And I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here tonight. It's really wonderful to have such a diverse panel from all of the different aspects of applying for fellowships and receiving fellowships. And I hope everyone tonight will learn a lot. I started my legal career as a fellow. I was a Skadden Fellow at the Legal Aid Society of DC. And then after that, I worked at American University's Washington College of Law. I was actually the assistant director for the Office of Public Interest. And so in that role, I was also quite focused on fellowships and helping law students to figure out what a fellowship is, how to apply for a fellowship, and just sort of the nuts and bolts, which is a lot of what we're going to cover tonight. So I'm really excited to be moderating this discussion and to learn from all of our panelists. So I think we can just jump right in with sort of giving each of you a chance to introduce yourself and maybe just tell a little bit about your relationship to the fellowship process and just where you work and how you're related to the fellowship process. So why don't we go ahead and start with Sharian Scott. She's a current fellow. And you want to just tell us a little bit about your project, your host organization, and which fellowship program you're a part of.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sherion Scott. I am a Skadden Fellow at Advancement Project in DC. I'm in my second year. My project's focused on rights restoration work for people with felony convictions. So I work in our Power and Democracy program, which is voting, and focus on rights restoration as part of my work. And I was on the panel last year for fellowships talking about the Skadden experience and applying. And so I'm happy to share more about that with you this year.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, and then next, why don't we turn to Jennifer Lavalley at Legal Aid. Tell us a little bit about your role and how fellows are related to your organization.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, David. I'm Jen Lavalley. I am the Consumer Unit Supervising Attorney at the Legal Aid Society of DC, where I had the pleasure of working with David many years ago. In my role as Consumer Law Unit Supervisor, we practice in doing foreclosure prevention, debt collection defense. And what's been really cool about fellowships is that the consumer unit is one of the smallest and newest units at Legal Aid, and fellowships have really been a critical way where we have sort of slowly grown our practice and tried to figure out how to start new areas of expertise. And 11 years ago, when I started my public interest career at Legal Aid, I also joined as a fellow through AmeriCorps Equal Justice Works, and have since been involved in fellowship applications for other fellows and supervised fellows. And we have an incoming fellow this fall. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks to everybody for joining.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, next we'll move to Chrissy Colvin. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about where you work and your relationship to the fellowship process.
Sure. Well, my name is Chrissy Colvin. I am the program manager for the Design Your Own Fellowships team at Equal Justice Works. So in my role as program manager, I work with host organizations and prospective applicants while they think through what their innovative and discrete projects are going to look like. And then I also work with fellows once they're on the field to make sure they're taking advantage of the full fellowship program. So what we offer in terms of the loan repayment assistance program, making sure that we provide opportunities for networking and engaging with each other, themselves and each other, providing programmatic support once you're in the field. And then also at the conclusion of that fellowship term, welcoming folks into our extensive network of fellow alum. So 2,200 fellow alum are in the field, and making sure that they engage not only as a fellow for the 2 years in the field, but also as they launch their careers in public interest. So very glad to be here today and to see some familiar faces on the panel and hear lots of questions from folks that are listening in.
Yes, thank you. We'll definitely have a chance for question and answer at the end. So please do put your questions in the question box if you have them. And Linda Anderson Stanley, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your relationship to the fellowship process.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Linda Anderson Stanley. I am a senior manager at Equal Justice Works, working on our cohort fellowships. I am also an adjunct professor at Stetson University College of Law, and I'm a prior public interest legal services attorney myself before joining Equal Justice Works. And so on our cohort fellowship models, we align our programs directly to a single state-based or national issue that's kind of defined by Equal Justice Works. And we use our cohort model to place fellows at legal services organizations where they kind of serve alongside each other and share resources so that they can become more effective advocates in that designated issue area. So we currently have an elder justice program, a disaster resilience program, and a housing justice program that we place fellows into on that cohort side of things.
Fantastic, thank you. And we're also joined by Sam Halbert. He'll be coming on the screen later to sort of walk us through the PSJD website, which is hosted by NALP, the National Association of Law Placement. So as you can see, we're going to be looking at this fellowship process from every angle. And really excited to have all of these really great speakers with us tonight. So let's sort of look at the process, I guess, from start to finish here. I want to start with Sherry-Ann. How did you make the decision to apply for a fellowship in the first place?
So I actually came to a fellowship through a kind of winding path. I heard about fellowships throughout law school, and I was always a public interest focused student, but I wasn't set on applying, and I actually didn't really start to think about it until after I had graduated, but that's because I was doing a clerkship. So I first learned about it through a professor in my 2L fall. She mentioned that since I was public interest minded and I had pretty good grades, maybe I should think about doing a Skadden fellowship, because I think she'd had a student in her past that had done Skadden, so she was most familiar with that fellowship. And so she planted it in my mind, but that fall or around that, I guess, winter, I got a clerkship in 2L year. So I knew that after I was graduating, I was going to work for a judge and I had more time. So I kind of put fellowships on the back burner, but I did keep in my mind that if I wanted to do a fellowship, I should be thinking through like possible projects, maybe host organizations. So as I chose my 2L summer job and 3L clinics and externships, I was passively like maybe scouting out project options and host orgs, but I didn't really start the process until like after I had graduated and was working for the judge. And the professor who initially planted it in my mind, she once again said, if you're wanting to apply to Skadden, this will be the time. This was like the summer before I started my clerkship, actually, when I was studying for the bar. It was fun. And so she actually brought it back up and I was like, oh, I guess I should look into that. And it was June, which was kind of late to start thinking about projects and host orgs, at least compared to some other people who had started in the spring. But I was able to talk with my professor and start to think about ideas. And she kind of guided me to an organization I had already interned for. So that made it a little bit easier for me to start the process, even though I was just starting in like June. So it was kind of winding, and eventually, I think something that also helped was that where I am now and where I ended up applying had quite a few fellows. And so that encouraged me to think, okay, it's doable and this organization has lots of experience having fellows. So that kind of encouraged me because I met fellows while I was interning there and I got to talk to them about their projects and see what it was like. And that kind of encouraged me to apply again.
It sounds like you were juggling a lot with the clerkship, fellowship application, the bar. But it's a great story just to demonstrate that there is no one path to a fellowship, right? There's lots of people they apply at different points in the year. They may do a clerkship first, they may not. So that's a great demonstration of that. And also just the importance of having someone like your professor at your law school that you can ask questions of and that can sort of help mentor you through the process. So Jen, can you tell us, how does a public interest organization make the decision that it's going to explore hosting a fellow? What does that process sort of look like, and and how does it work at your organization?
Sure. I only have the perspective of how this looks at my organization, but I can tell you that at the Legal Aid Society of DC, which is a relatively large, I think, and then relatively, tries to take advantage of fellowship opportunities on a fairly regular basis. It's how we start a lot of attorneys and new projects. Every year when we know that sort of the season for starting those applications is approaching, it's kind of a natural way that we are forced as an organization, and especially at the leadership level, to take stock of what our current practices look like, if there are unmet needs, and whether we think we're on a path towards growth where, because I think in general, we don't go in for fellowships where we don't believe there's a decent chance that we'll be able to continue it permanently. That's sort of the point. We're not just trying to get someone to help us out on something for 2 years. We're really trying to grow. And so it's a natural time to take stock of where we would like to expand, if there are any gaps we need to fill. And so sometime around the summer, and if it helps anyone to not panic, if they're sort of more in that like June, July time period, like what Sherry-Ann was describing, that even if it feels late compared to some of your peers for our organization, I think we only posted the announcement probably, I don't know, a few weeks ago, because it takes time to sort of figure out what projects you want to. So in some years, we have a very specific thing in mind and want to post a fellowship application sort of position based on something that we know we want to expand into. And in other years, like this year, we post something that's more general, that kind of puts it to the applicants to say, come to us with what you're interested in. These are our issue areas. So we'd like it to fit within one of these issue areas. We'd like it to be timely, but, and so it kind of depends on the year, but I would just say we think about it, we talk about it, and then we post and we see what comes in.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like, those postings are really important for potential applicants to get a sense for what you're looking for as an organization and to see how much flexibility there is there. So Linda and Chrissy, can you tell me a little bit about how Equal Justice Works finds the funding for the fellowships and what the process is like for applying for those?
Sure, I can start. It's a little different for both of our processes, but on the cohort side of things, typically our process begins with Equal Justice Works designing a program around a specific important civil legal aid issue or community. Then we start working on funding for the program as a whole. So most of our funding on the cohort side comes from private foundations or from the government. Some of our larger major donors are places like the Kellogg Foundation, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, the Department of Justice. Sometimes we work with local organizations and bar foundations as well. We have an entire team dedicated to fundraising, and they do a really great job to always make sure that we're elevating our programs to potential donors who are interested in our designated issue areas so we can secure as many fellowships as possible. Once we have that program designed and funded, then Equal Justice Works actually solicits the host organizations we work with rather than the fellows themselves through a competitive selection process. So once we've selected the host organization, they're actually the ones who actively recruit their fellows. We assist a bit with job descriptions and promoting the position, but ultimately the host organization is responsible for selecting their own fellow.
Yeah, and as Linda mentioned, it looks really, really different on my side of the aisle. So on the Design Your Own side, that same really incredible fundraising team and a few other folks at our organization reach out to law firms and corporations, foundations, and individuals to solicit their investment into the Design Your Own Fellowship program. So this model will offer candidates with their dedicated passions and demonstrated passions and a host org with a strategic need and vision to come together, design the project, and submit that project directly to Equal Justice Works. So it looks a little bit different. Each of our sponsors have their own preferences. And some of our sponsors have very broad preferences, but some of them have some narrow ones. So I'll mention that our sponsor preferences are available publicly for folks that would like to take a look. And so sponsors will come to us, maybe a law firm will come to us and say, we have offices in these cities across the US, so we would like to sponsor a fellow in one of these cities, or a corporation will come to us and say, we would like to sponsor a fellow tackling this legal issue or filling in this gap. And so there is a list, and that's publicly available at equaljusticeworks.org. And I encourage applicants as they're considering the application to take a look at that, not as an end all be all, but just as another data point while you're crafting that application, which is quite intensive. I'll mention that the application for Equal Justice Works Design Your Own Projects opened on June 15th, but won't close until September 20th. And so we are very much looking forward to receiving lots of applications this cycle, including folks in the audience today. Excited to read those once they come in.
So this is probably somewhat confusing to people who are hearing it all for the first time, but trust me, it makes sense once you sort of start thinking through all the options and learning more about how everything works. So the funding for these fellowships, the money that's going to end up paying your salary as a fellow comes from a variety of different places, right? So for the Skadden Fellowship, it's coming from the Skadden Foundation, and then you're applying with a project to the foundation. It sounds like for the cohorts through the Equal Justice Works is pulling the money together, and then they're selecting organizations that where they're going to sponsor fellowships. And as a law student, you would align yourself with one of those organizations. And then also at Equal Justice Works, you have the Design Your Own, where as a law student, you would work with a nonprofit to come up with a project that you would pitch to Equal Justice Works. And then, Jen at Legal Aid, you're not paying for any of the fellowships. You're hosting law students, soon to be attorneys, in their projects, and they are working with you to apply to these different funding opportunities. So I don't know if, correct me if I misstated any of that, but I'm trying to kind of provide a little synopsis of what we just heard, because it is a little confusing.
I think that's really helpful, David. I was trying to do the same thing. And if just to add on to that, in putting myself in the position of a law student trying to figure out, a job and a fellowship as being one way of getting a job, it seems to me that there are really two paths from the perspective of an applicant. One is that if you already have a relationship with an organization that you think might be interested in a project and you have an idea for a project, one avenue could just be, whether they've posted anything or not, to start the conversation and pitch it, right? And see if you want to get them on board with going in on one of these fellowship applications together. If that's not you, and you're thinking more broadly, like I am looking for a job, I might have things I'm particularly interested in, but it could be a variety of things, then you're really, I think, looking for job postings on organizations' websites. Because if an organization has been selected for like the cohort model, I would think they're posting a position for a specific job and you're just applying to it like any other job. That's what my fellowship was like, 11 years ago or whenever that was. But it could also be, if it's the Design Your Own, you might also see like a position announcement, like what Legal Aid has got up right now, which is this generalized, like, we're accepting applications for fellowships. Maybe it tells you what subject matter we're interested in, maybe it doesn't. It could be that we're going to go in on Skadden and EJW and your law school fellowship, but it's kind of a generic, we're looking for candidates to select to go in on an application together. So I think those are the two paths, right? You're like looking for job postings, or you actually have a very specific project and organization in mind that you might want to pitch from scratch.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. And to bring it down to an actual example, Sharian, what was it like to find your sponsor and to work with them on the application process? And did you have a project in mind, or did the Advancement Project have something in mind when you approached them about the possibility of being a host? How did all of that work?
Yeah, and so I'm actually gonna piggyback on some of the things Jennifer said, because I think there's a few ways you can come to a host org. And for me, I was the person who had worked at my organization before, and I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to do. But just to give you another few options, because some people don't have an organization where they worked before. I know one of my colleagues, and unfortunately she did the same thing. She was an intern and ended up back where we are. But she mentioned that when she was searching, she kind of just Googled organizations. Like, if you have a passion or something that you want to work on, or like while you're working 1L summer, if you have clinics, you come into contact with people or an issue that you become passionate about, and you see a need and you're like, why is no one doing anything about this? That's a way you can get an idea of what you want to work on. And so if you have that idea but nowhere to go, you can just start Googling organizations that do something similar to what you want to do. And you can just reach out to them and say, hey, I really want to do work here. Would you be interested in hosting a fellow? Kind of like Jennifer saying, like, her organization posts a position, but some organizations, especially smaller ones that are under-resourced, they would love to have someone who comes with funding, because it's like a free attorney. And granted, you might want to scope out, like, what is it like to work there? Is it a place in like an area that you'd be willing to move to? But if you don't know of an organization, that is one route, is just to search and reach out to them and ask, would they be interested in hosting you? But one of the easier routes is to go somewhere you know and you've worked before. And so, as I mentioned, when I was choosing employers and working at my 2L summer job, I was asking the HR and people who were there, like, do you normally host fellows? Do you have fellows who are currently here? And kind of scoping out, would they be willing to have me apply while I was already there, and building that relationship with them so that they know you when you wanted to come back. So just dropping that in. And then for me, because I knew them, it was kind of like Jennifer was saying, I reached out to one of my former supervisors and said, hey, I might be interested in doing a fellowship. Are you hosting fellows this year? And then they had a meeting with me. And in theory, I applied, like I sent my resume, but they all knew me. And I think they did have other applicants. I'm not sure what happened on the back end, but obviously they chose me. They chose to sponsor me, like Jennifer's saying. And usually, I'm not sure if all orgs are like this, but I think organizations, they can choose to apply for various fellowships with you. So like once they choose you, they'll try for maybe Skadden and Equal Justice Works. And I did apply to Equal Justice Works. I didn't apply to Justice Catalyst or Soros. Those are some others. All of them are open depending on the topic. And some orgs will have you apply to all of them to just cast a wide net. Though I think we normally shoot for Skadden because they typically had a lot of them, but I applied to Equal Justice Works as well, working with my organization to form that application. Because when you have a project, usually your organization will want to input on the ideas because they have to help you shape how it will look. So that's what we did. After they chose me, we spent like a month or so fleshing out what the project will look like. And so I guess it kind of aligned with the work they were already doing. And so that's another way to approach it is, if you know what the organization's doing and you want to put a spin on it and add something new, you can do that. And that is one approach. But as Jennifer was saying, like maybe the org has an idea for a whole new project that's never been done. You might have to work on them with that. So it just really depends. And also like what they want and what you want. Because I know some people who were Skaddens, they created like a whole new project where they started a clinic and that clinic had never been done before. And an organization might be willing to host that if it's kind of aligned with what they do, but they've always needed someone to start this. So it really just depends on your interests and what like the organization needs.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point that, you know, we have representatives tonight that are talking about Equal Justice Works and Skadden, but there are also other fellowships, which is an important point to remember. There are other sort of organization-based or project-based fellowships that you can explore and that you could apply to. Chrissy and Linda, anything to add about sort of the process of finding your host organization if you're a student looking to do a fellowship?
I will just say on the cohort side of things, again, like I said, we're the ones that select the host organization. So if you see an opportunity available for a cohort model, know that we've kind of already done some of the vetting for you. So if you're not sure what kind of host organization you want to work with, we've spent a lot of time doing an in-depth review of the organization to make sure that there's someone that would be suitable to host a fellow and that can adequately supervise you and have a place for you to be. So on that side of things, we've already kind of done the work for you.
Absolutely. And, you know, similarly on the DYO side, the design your own side or the project-based, we, in the application process is an opportunity for the host organization to share more about how they plan to support the fellow, what infrastructure already exists for supervision and adequate legal expertise, and they certify those benefits and the salary. So there's a lot of opportunity at the application stage to have those conversations because you're not just piecing together the application, and that might feel like its own project, but you're also selecting your employer for 2 years. And so go into it of the mindset of these individuals at the host organization may be interviewing you, and also you're interviewing them to make sure that it's a good fit, because the best applications, the ones that do the best in our competitive process, are the ones that have demonstrated that this is the right person at the right organization, at the right, tackling the right issue, and it's at the right time. I really love this point too about using your network to your full advantage. And so places where you've had internships are a really good place to start, but also Google's a great resource, as is the Equal Justice Works website, right? So we have all of our fellows and a lot of our alums online currently. And so take a look at that list. There are going to be fellows that may align with your issue areas or your projects, and there will definitely be host organizations that you will see are interested in pursuing that work as well. So this isn't just a staff attorney position, it's an innovative and discrete project. We love hearing fellows come to us and say, thank you so much for letting us live out our dream jobs or create our dream jobs. And similarly for host organizations that share, we wouldn't have been able to pursue this work if it weren't this innovative work, if it weren't for this funding model. And so we love hearing those stories, and we are very excited. We're so excited about the application process, and there's lots of people on your side that want to make this work for you too.
So it sounds like if you're looking to do a fellowship, you can go to the Equal Justice Works website to see some options as to who's looking for a fellow. It sounds like also we've talked about just sort of using Google, using your network, using resources to find organizations doing the type of work that you want to do and see if there's a possibility there. Jen, I know you said that, you know, Legal Aid was putting out postings saying we're looking for fellows. Where were those postings? Probably on PSJD, which we'll learn about later today. But are there other places that that people would find the posting?
Yeah, I think the other main places might be like Idealist and law school, law school system, job posting systems. Exactly.
Career sites. Yep.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to offer the opportunity for people to just remind us, when is the ideal time to start the process? And you can interpret that question however you like. You might want to offer advice about, when is the ideal time to start forging a relationship with an organization, or you might want to just tell us what the deadlines are for applying for the fellowships. But what's sort of a timeline that we should have in mind here? And anyone can jump in.
Well, I'll say, I think probably the sooner the better, knowing that the deadlines, I think for most fellowships are towards the middle to end of September. There's also a reality that I think it kind of depends on how ready the host organization is to get moving. So speaking from the perspective of mine, I don't know exactly where we are in the current hosting because I'm not involved in that team this year, but I was last year. And it was like kind of a mad rush to the end during the months of August and September, because first there was choosing the candidate who we were going to sponsor. And then there was working on the application. Just like Sharian said, we were really involved in sort of partnering on that application. And so it takes time. I think it's probably not unusual for a lot of that to be more on the back end, but there's a lot of calling and talking and drafting that needs to happen to get your application over the finish line. So earlier the better, but I would think that late summer is quite typical. So it's not too late.
Yeah, I was just about to share the deadline because I know Skadden, it keeps getting earlier. I think when I applied, it was later in September, like maybe September 24th. And I think Equal Justice Works is usually around the same time. So working backwards, you want to allow time to obviously proofread multiple times, not just yourself, but also your host org, obviously, maybe even a professor or another third eye, someone who's an expert in the area you're applying. And so at least, I don't know, maybe a week to have people read over it, review, get feedback. And then of course there's weeks for drafting. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, but the Equal Justice Works application is way more involved in Skadden. And I don't know about the other fellowships, but I even recommend, like, even if you're not applying for Equal Justice Works, I applied, but to fill the application out because it's so comprehensive and it requires you to really think through your project. And so that would take you some time to get through and really give meaningful responses, especially because Equal Justice Works, they want you to lay out, like, what is your 6-month goal going to look like? What is your 12-month project going to look like? And so you really have to think through your application. It's not something you can do in a rush. And from my experience, I basically took all of August to do that. And so start now. I would say the sooner you start, the better. So it'll keep you from being super stressed. But if you're a 2L, a rising 2L, just finished 1L, then I'd recommend starting in the spring to at least map out like what are you interested in doing, what are some orgs, so that by the time June comes around, if organizations are starting to open to people to apply, internally to choose you to sponsor, then you're ready to start reaching out to those orgs in June. And you already have some things to pitch, you already have some places lined up if you're just going into your 2L year.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I'm noticing in the chat, Christina Jackson reminded us that another place you can find postings is on the Public Interest Jobs Clearinghouse that's put out by Washington Council of Lawyers. And she also put in the deadlines for this year. So the SCADN application deadline is September 10th, and the Equal Justice Works application deadline is September 20th. So I don't know if Chrissy or Linda, if you had anything to add about when people should start, or if we've covered all the bases.
Go ahead, Chrissy.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, I think, that just about covers it. I think it's never too early in your law school career to start thinking about fellowship. So if you're a 2L, you can start kind of laying the groundwork now, thinking about the relationships that you're building on a professional level, who's going to write your letter of recommendations, who will be your professional references. And then when it comes to the application, it's due in September 20th. And so it's never too early to start. As of today, it's not too late to start thinking about your application, but you will want to allow yourself enough time, as was mentioned, to just be thoughtful about your answers and make your application a compelling and competitive one. I'll share that we launched a candidate survey last year where folks identified that they're spending between 40 and 100 hours piecing together their applications to get them ready to hit submit. So that's quite an investment. And, some of that time is on the phone with host organizations and hashing out details and drafts and redrafts. So it is an intensive process. It's something to be really proud of once you're ready to hit submit. So definitely never too early to start, but I agree. The earlier you get started on the actual application, the better.
And just to kind of throw a wrench in things and say something totally different, there is no standard timeline for a cohort fellowship. We actually have a rolling and seasonal deadlines pending availability for a particular cohort. So right now we're currently working on expanding our disaster resilience program into California, New Orleans, and New Mexico in the fall, and also potentially adding in additional housing fellowships this fall as well. So once we've selected our host organizations for these programs, we definitely share the job postings for the actual fellowships. So really the best way to keep up to date with potential openings for cohort fellowships is to follow Equal Justice Works on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and then frequently check our website on the Become a Fellow section and check for fellowship program opportunities. And it doesn't hurt just to check back all the time and see what might be available.
So does that mean you could have just graduated from law school and you could end up applying for one of the cohort fellowships in the fall and start working in the spring?
Yep.
Okay. So it really is a rolling process.
Very different.
Great to know. In case anyone's afraid that they've missed a deadline, there are rolling deadlines. And also it's helpful to hear that number of the number of hours that you need to be able to put aside for a fellowship application. So sort of chronologically moving through the whole process, let's get to the application. What does the application for each of these fellowships look like? Is there an interview? Is there a skills test? Is there an essay? Like just a sort of a broad view of what the application looks like.
I can start, and then it might be good for Jen to give a little explanation on this side of things. So our application, again, is actually really focused on the host organization and not the fellow themselves. So I'm not going to go into all of that detail. But once a host organization is selected and then recruitment begins for the fellow positions, it looks really similar to a standard job application. You're going to submit your resume and cover letter and do an interview with the actual host organization. So maybe Jen, you can talk about what it looks like on your side when you guys are looking for a fellow.
Yeah, happy to jump in on that. So it's really like a two-stage process, right? Because at least for the design your own, because if it were a cohort model, then it really is, right? It's like applying for a job. And so we will often do sort of a screening interview and then a longer callback interview. And sometimes we will do a practical exercise, we'll ask you to write something or to make a quick argument on something. But if it's going to be a design your own, which is what we've been doing most recently, the two stages are really first a general kind of, we're selecting our fellow who's going to be a good fit at our organization, who seems excited about the project. But then like the actual application where we're now, we've selected our person, we're going to be the host site, and we're both applying together, is this 42, I forget how many, upwards of 100 hours process that was described. And I agree with that. At least from our perspective, it's quite intense. It's usually we'll have 2 to 3 applications going at the same time, and you're trying to draft thoughtful descriptions of sort of the problem and the issue in a way that is well researched, that's supported by data, that jives well with how this work actually works in the local community. And so it probably depends on the organization, but for us, it's like multiple rounds of drafting back and forth, like probably a solid 3 rounds of drafting back and forth until we run out of time, and we'll often put it in the fellows' hands to do the first draft because we want the vision to start there. But there's a lot of investment, I think, on our part as a host organization to give them the tools to get up to speed and say, all right, I'm going to send you a bunch of articles, a bunch of data that we've got, just to give you something to work with, and just take your first crack at it. And then we'll look at it and we'll revise and we'll have our call and we'll do it, but it's pretty intensive, but only because I think we're trying to get a really compelling quality application over the finish line by mid to late September that doesn't just look like a thoughtful description of why this project is like inspiring or exciting, but why this community needs it, and to show that we have thought very concretely about how we will execute it. So it's intensive, but it's worth it.
Any other descriptions of what the application itself looks like?
Sure, Jen, I really appreciate your perspective. And yeah, it is intensive. It's designed to be intensive. It's designed to make host organizations and candidates really think about carefully illustrating what the need is, what the need of the community is, and then sharing with us those ambitious but feasible goals and the project timeline. So not only illustrating in a really careful way that demonstrates to us that you get it, you understand the community, you know what that need is, and you've done your research and you've thought about it and you've been careful, but also how are you going to meaningfully fill that need or fill that gap? And so we ask for, our application is 3 main components. So the project description, where we ask for that statement of need and the goals and timeline of filling that need or meeting that need. Then we ask for a personal statement, which is really the candidate's opportunity to share more about their interest and commitment to public interest work and the issue areas and the communities that they're hoping to serve. And then we also ask for information from the host organization to make sure that if we do place a fellow at your organization, how will this typically a newer or first-year lawyer be supported in implementing the discrete and innovative project? So what's the supervision structure look like? Have you hosted fellows in the past? Those types of questions. So it's a 3-pronged application. It's not a typical job application. It's not a typical cover letter or a typical legal paper. It requires creative thinking. It requires a type of writing that maybe as a law student you haven't had a ton of experience with, or it's been trained out of you not to be a creative writer, but to do legal writing. So it requires a lot of skill just to submit a compelling application. And so that's why we really encourage folks to take their time and get it right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was just going to say really quickly, for the Skadden application, it's similarly like you should be very thoughtful, but it is less in detail in a way. They do not ask about timelines as much, and it's only 4 essay questions, and they have some word limits. So even there, it's less content in a way. I think they've adjusted, like I know in recent years, they've like added a question about like, how does this fit into like racial justice and addressing like systemic issues? That's a new question that they recently added. But overall, like there's that question, one question about like your project, obviously synopsis. There's another question about like, why are you passionate about public interest work and what made you interested in your project? And then I think there's another question that just wants like your background in public interest and how those past projects tie into your current one. So those are the four, and that's really it outside of like questions about you. And they're all word limits. So you also have to be very concise and intentional with what you're listing there because the Skadden application is rather short in a way.
That's really helpful to hear all those details. And, you know, it sounds like the process of applying for these fellowships is probably good practice if you're going to be doing any grant applications in your career. You know, at IUTA as the language access director, you know, we apply for grants and I'm doing grant applications and all of this comes into play, right? Like the need of the community, how you're going to meet that need. And then, you know, your organizations and your individual capacity to execute the project. You know, mentioning, you know, has the organization hosted fellows before? You know, what is your personal experience with this type of work? So all of that's really important to include in there. And also, these applications are good practice for any sort of a grant application that you might be involved with in the future. So you've turned in your application. You've turned in your application. You're done with perhaps the 40 to 100 hours of drafting the application. You've turned it in. What does it look like after that? What are the steps that happen after you've turned in the application?
Sure, I will kick us off here. So after you have spent your time crafting your project proposal, your business case, and you hit submit, you take a deep breath and you celebrate that you've hit that button finally after all of the time that you've committed to that. And then on the Equal Justice Work side, we send it to our alumni reviewers. So fellow alums are actually the first group of folks that will take a look at your application. And they will take a look and score, and assess, and then score the applications and then send them back to us. And then between November and December is when our rolling interview basis will start. So based on the score of the application, the sponsor preferences, Equal Justice Works does its own assessment of each of the applications to see where it fits. We send off slates of candidates to our sponsor, to our interested sponsors, and the sponsors select a handful of folks to interview. The interview process, it's a 30-minute interview process, and you'll be interviewed by a panel of individuals from Equal Justice Works and the sponsor themselves. And that's when you really pitch your idea. So it comes to life during that interview process, and we help candidates get prepared by that. We send our tip for preparation and any information that we think is pertinent to bring with you as part of that interview. And then if you may interview in November, December, and in your first interview, you were successful and you've got a fellow and we'll place you in the field. But if not, you've interviewed and maybe you weren't successful, we'll get you some feedback, we'll let you know, and you remain in our active pool. So you can be selected to interview multiple times throughout the process, and you can be selected anytime between November and when the application cycle or the selection cycle closes, which is between March and April, typically of the following year. That is a long time to stay engaged in that selection cycle. And I know it can feel really grueling for folks as they're hoping to hear back from us. So we try our best to stay in constant communication or frequent communication with our candidates to let them know where we are in the cycle and when they can expect to hear from us next. We also ask that candidates let us know if they've been selected for other fellowship programs. So maybe they've interviewed with Skadden and that went really well, so they're now going to be a Skadden fellow. That's great. Just let us know. We'll pull you out of our pool and we'll make space for other interested applicants in that rolling interview process. It looks a lot different on the Skadden side, and it looks a lot different on the cohort side at Equal Justice Work even. So,
Linda, do you want to tell us about the cohort, and then we'll hear about
Yeah,
Skadden?
sure. So not much on this side of things from us, but like I said before, you submit your application or your job application to the host organization directly, and they have the ultimate decision on who to hire to fulfill that fellowship. But sometimes Equal Justice Works is asked to weigh in on reviewing resumes and in interviews, but typically those look like your standard job interview and varies depending on the host organization and their process. Once the fellow is actually selected by the host organization, that's when Equal Justice Works has more interaction with the actual fellow. So we'll work closely with them at that point to sign a fellowship agreement, create a work plan for your fellowship, and set up your Equal Justice Works fellow profile. We have an orientation to closely go over all of the fellowship requirements and typically have a kickoff event to give you some time to get to know your other cohort members and include some substantive training on the specific issue area of that cohort.
Fantastic. And for the SCADN, yeah.
Yeah. So for the SCADN process, it's kind of similar but different. It's actually really short and surprisingly simple in a way. Once you turn in your application, there's really only one interview, and it's really small. You will get notified if you're a finalist or a semi-finalist, I guess. I checked the website on September 23rd. So your application's due on the 10th. So about 2 weeks later, they'll let you know if you're one of the 100 people that are selected for an interview. And then in between the 23rd and like the first 2 weeks of October, they'll hold interviews in a city near you. Usually it's like New York, DC, Chicago, and a couple on the West Coast. And so they'll fly you to like wherever they are meeting you, and they'll hold interviews. And the interview will be with the head of the SCADN Foundation, who is Kathleen Rubenstein, and one of the partners at the SCADN law firm in that city. So they have a kind of a group of partners that are really interested in the SCADN Foundation and the SCADN work, and they've become regulars at helping decide some of the applications. So when I interviewed with Kathleen and one of the DC partners, and that's all you interview with. You spend about 30 minutes to an hour with them. And similarly to what Chrissy was saying, it's when you get to sell not just your project, but yourself. SCADN's very interested in the person, their background, what brought them to the work, and they're also their vision for what they want to do after the fellowship and how they will use that for their career. And so it is kind of like getting a feel for everything and how it will work together. And from that, Kathleen and the partner take their notes from the interview and they give it to a board of trustees. And so after that interview, you don't get to do anything else with your application. You will hear maybe a few days later whether you're one of the finalists. They choose 56 people. And so those 56, their names go to the board with the notes from the interview. And then from there, the board will decide who are the final 28. And they deliberate, I think it's said November 10th, and you will know by November 11th whether you're chosen. And that's really it. So it's very fast. You'll know before Thanksgiving, and there's only one short interview, and that's all you really get. So that's why I guess your application and selling yourself in the interview are really important, because it's all based on that and the notes from that. And also though, something that SCADN like doesn't necessarily post is like being connected with other fellows and having them be able to vouch for you and kind of like give a statement on your behalf, especially if you're working on an area that they work in. They can say like, I know this person will bring something new to the work. You should go for them. Like that really helps your application too. So I would say like connecting with current and past fellows is also a key part of the SCADN process, because that helps give them a better picture of you, since there's not like a ton of other interviews.
So you found out in November that you got a SCADN fellowship, and then I guess you started in September. And I'm wondering what has it been like being a fellow, and how is that different than being a staff attorney? And what has your experience been like being a fellow?
Yeah, well, something cool that happened in between, and I guess David, you probably did this, is they have a symposium. So before I started, like I found out in November, and then from then until all the way in September the following year, I just wait around and I guess, connected to your organization and kind of on board. But in between, they have a symposium every spring around April in New York, where they fly all the like current fellows and prospective fellows out, and you get to meet one another, network, hear about each other's work. And so that was kind of my introduction. And SCADN tries to have some programming here and there, book clubs, and are always obviously willing to connect fellows with one another. So that's been part of my like just on the side fellowship process. But working in my organization, I I think this is the experience of a lot of people, but typically you tend to be treated just like an attorney. My organization, I mean, I list Skadden Fellow / staff attorney, but I basically function like a normal attorney. I have all the same expectations, like the meetings. We even had litigation that was just on voting, you know, around the last election. And though it's not my expertise and it wasn't my project, I still helped out in that lawsuit. I've helped out in other areas, and I've taken on work that initially wasn't part of my project, but it's just part of being in your program and what your organization does. But I've also, on the flip side, been able to have some leeway in bringing new work to the organization and bringing new ideas. And so they do, you know, keep in mind that I'm there with a goal, and my intention was to work on this particular area. But my experiences have been a range and included a variety of work that wasn't necessarily foreseen at the beginning of my project. I'll also say that I know Skadden approaches it a lot differently than Equal Justice Works, where once you get a Skadden fellowship, they're kind of not checking in much to see like if you're doing exactly what you said you would do. And you kind of, so you have some leeway of like, okay, if I don't do exactly what I laid out and I have to vary a little, especially with something like COVID that happens, then they're fine, as long as you're working and you're committed to what you're doing. Whereas I know Equal Justice Works really what checks in at the 6 months, at the 12, at the 18 to see like, how is your project coming along? And there's a little more proactive support, especially professionally too. So that is a difference while you're going through your fellowship. But other than that, like your organization is hopefully shaping you and guiding you into like accomplishing your fellowship in some way, shape, or form.
Jen, is that similar at Legal Aid, sort of the difference between a fellow and a staff attorney? And what's the transition like if someone stays on and they go from being a fellow to a full-time attorney?
Yeah, I think it is very similar. I think the feeling is that when we're going in on applications and selecting a candidate for a fellowship, we want someone who's both excited about their project and loves legal aid and wants to work at legal aid long term, because we hope for that too, even though we can't usually guarantee that. And so yes, I think it looks and feels very much like a staff attorney position, just with some extra extra goals, extra reporting, extra events and opportunities. And then the transition, my personal experience transitioning from a fellowship to a staff attorney was that it wasn't much of one. It was great. It was, I talked with my organization as we were getting close. I was thrilled to learn when I was able to stay on. I think we have a pretty good track record at Legal Aid of being able to keep people on. And I just kept doing my work with my same colleagues on my same team. And I think that's typical, at least for our organization. I saw one of the questions in the Q&A, I think, was about like whether people should pitch projects that are really discreet and that you think you could like wrap up during your time and be done, versus ones that seem like they could be permanent. From my perspective at Legal Aid, though I'd love to hear if there are different thoughts from the other panelists. Permanent is the way to look at it. I mean, you want it to be timely, so something that seems to be a particular need for now, and maybe there's a spin on what the organization is already doing, like Sharian said. But I think the idea that it would be lasting and that it could evolve with the needs of the community is really important, because we don't want to just like drop a project at the end of 2 years if there's anything we can do to help it. And that's why the transition, in the best of all worlds, is not much of one.
Yeah, and I think just quickly on that, I think a lot of people, I don't know, I don't have statistics, but I know quite a few people that end up staying at the organization for at least a year or two more. And I mentioned a colleague who, she's been there since I was an intern. So I guess like 5 years now. So 2 were fellowship and she just stayed on. And it was a transition of basically her continuing the work she had already been doing. Whereas I'm actually moving on. I applied to Department of Justice honors program, and that was also another really early process. So I've known since December that I'm leaving, and I've started telling people and I'm transitioning out. But I think I could have stayed if I wanted to. But keeping in mind that one issue with staying is that for particularly smaller organizations, they need to have funding for you. Because obviously if you're doing a fellowship, you're being paid for by someone else, either Skadden or the sponsors through Equal Justice Works, or, you know, and the different systems they have set up there. But if you're becoming a staff attorney, your funding's ending and they would have to pay for you. And so I know some places you have to have a discussion about whether they have a position. They may want to keep you, but it's finding the money. And sometimes that's applying for grants to cover your role. And so you might have to start working on grants early enough if you're planning to transition to staying at the organization, but your fellowship is ending. So keeping that in mind, and starting that conversation early enough. Like, I probably would have started asking around the spring, but it would depend on, like, if you have other places you're looking and applying. It is rough to, like, time applications while also trying to talk to your host org. But knowing that, you should definitely start thinking about, do you want to stay? Who should I talk to? And getting your options together, probably at least by the spring.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And different organizations have different fiscal years, right? And you never know when your organization is going to start thinking about the future. So it's important to talk to them early. In the case that there's some fundraising or grant applications that need to happen in order for you to stay on, for sure. So I definitely want to make sure that we have time to look over the PSJD website. So we'll probably turn to that now, and then we'll go to the question and answer box and pull out a few questions for us to answer before we sort of give some final thoughts. But right now, I want to turn it over to Sam Halpert from NALP to show us a little bit around the PSJD website.
Thanks, David. And thank you also for letting me go before the question and answer, because share what I can about PSJD. I feel like that's often the thing that people remember best from events that they attend, and emphasize that what people are hearing from all of the folks that you've been engaging with so far is, I think, a lot more detailed and nuanced and relevant than what I have to say. That said, there's a reason why I'm here and why I'm saying what I am. My name is Sam Halpert. I am the Director of Public Service Initiatives for the National Association for Law Placement. One of our major public service initiatives is psjd.org. I'm hoping that all of you are familiar with PSJD already, but in case you're not, it is a jobs database that we maintain and an employer directory. It's similar to Idealist in that it focuses on nonprofit and government positions, but distinct in that it's looking exclusively at jobs that either require or prefer candidates with formal legal training. And so we're trying to hit the positions that do most. And for most of you, it should be free. PSJD is available to students and alumni of all of our subscribing law schools for free, and most ABA approved schools in the United States subscribe. So you should be able to go to the site and create an account and start doing these things that I'm talking about with no trouble at all. So that's a little bit about PSJD. I want to talk a little bit about how we categorize fellowship positions on our system, which is related to these kinds of distinctions that you've been hearing about earlier tonight, but subtly different. So there are three types of fellowship categories that you'll see when you start to browse our database. The first one is what we call project-based fellowships. And a lot of what we've heard tonight has been about these sort of project-based fellowships. From PSJD's perspective, the key distinction is that there is this two-step application process that's similar to writing a grant, where first you have to convince an organization that they should host you, and then you and the organization collaborate together to secure funding to execute the project. And that's distinct. Before I move on to the distinction, I should say, we've talked about Soros and Skadden and EJW. There are a variety of more niche funders. If I were presenting this in person, I would be able to click that link, but you can get the PowerPoint afterward and follow it yourself. It goes to a notice on PSJD for the Connecticut Bar Foundation, which has where they provide money for fellows to go to organizations based in Connecticut and do projects specifically within that state. And there are a number of these that are sort of not operating nationally, but are worth, if we can move to the next slide, I'd like to talk about the distinction we make between what we call the project-based fellowships and what we call organizational fellowships. Here, as you were hearing earlier, it's more similar to applying for a staff attorney position. The key distinction is that it's term limited employment. You're there for a year or for 2 years. There isn't that two-step application process. So by calling it an organizational fellowship, we're trying to indicate to you that the person that you're applying to, if you convince them that you're the person they should be working with, that's it. You guys are all set. The funding is internal. And so this distinction that the Design Your Own and the cohort organization that they are going to partner with on this, sort of is skirting the line between these for us. Some employers have a specific project that they're bringing the fellow on to run. We still wouldn't categorize that as a project fellowship. Funding is multi-organization. That's our key distinction. Slide. Something that hasn't come up quite as much tonight, category of fellowships, which we call, am I still? Okay. Yes, thank you. So the clinical and academic fellowships are organizational fellowships. The funding is internal to the organization that's running it, which is usually a law school. But we treat them as different because they are not with legal service providers. They are with educational institutions. There's often a teaching component attached to them, and there's often sort of one or more components of the role that are geared toward helping people toward a career in academia, as opposed to a career as a legal services attorney. And so it's a slightly different career track, even if the work that you're doing, day to day in a clinic can look quite similar. And so we treat them as a different category. Those are the 3 categories of legal fellowships that we have. We treat all of these, we mark them off specifically as ships on PSJD with additional care to the other jobs in our system. I'll talk about that before I get to that, though. It's also worth bearing in mind that there are non-legal fellowships for which you may be eligible and for which your legal training may be an advantage. On PSJD, we would not call these legal fellowships. These would come under the label when you're searching, but you will often find fellowship positions that are trying to complete some piece of work. These are usually more policy jobs, and they'll say anyone with an advanced degree that's relevant to this work, and that could be a degree in public health or economics or law. We post these notices when they come to us. Notices are forwarded to us by our member schools. They come to us from employers directly, and we conduct our own research to try and develop as comprehensive a picture as we can. But unlike the other fellowships, we don't put them through this special process that's designed to assist you with your fellowship search that I'm going to describe in a minute. So they aren't treated as fellowships in our system. They're just treated as JD Advantage jobs. This is a website that you can look at that collects more of these, but it's a category, particularly for people that are interested in policy, that's worth exploring when you're looking at the full universe of fellowships that you may be eligible for. If we move on to the next slide, thank you. So we do a number of things for fellowships in our jobs database that is unique to unique nature. We were talking earlier about when the application deadline for fellowships typically is, and people were saying, oh, in the 2-stage process, The application to the funder is usually due in early fall, and therefore a few months before that is when you need to sort of have formed your relationship with your host organization. And that's borne out by what you can see on PSJD. Most notices on PSJD, deadline passes, we take the notice down, we treat it as no longer relevant. For fellowship notices specifically, because often those notices will recur either every year or every other year, we'll leave them up. We put a special marker on them, this sort of historical plinth that's circled in orange. And so if you're interested only in things that are currently available, you can toggle those off in the database, but we show them to you so that if you are thinking prospectively about what you might do for your fellowship search next year, you can see all of the positions that over the course of June and July had a deadline as organizations were looking for the fellow that they wanted to pair with. So you can use this platform to do this kind of historical research and find out who was looking for a fellow and at what time of year. Additionally, when you're searching the jobs database, if you select one of the fellow categories from the sidebar, you'll be offered a new button up at the top, and this is on the next slide, circled in orange. Oh, the animations are working. I am so sorry. I didn't know we would have that. Yes, so if you select fellowships from the job type dropdown, I'm sorry, and can we advance one more time? You'll start to see that some of these notices in the database have this historical plinth icon on them. And this is the icon that I was just describing that shows you positions that are not currently seeking candidates, but that we've kept in our system so that people can plan a future fellowship search. And if we move on to the next, once you've selected one or more fellowship types from the sidebar where you can narrow your job search, you'll see a new icon appear in that top row of icons. And if you advance the slide, it should be circled. That invites you to also look at the same information in calendar form. You can also get to the calendar directly. You'll find it in the PSJD Resource Center, but the easiest way is to just start searching for fellowships in our job search tool, and we'll suggest that you visit it. And so the final slide will show you the fellowship calendar. Specifically, you can look at the notices in terms of when their deadline has occurred over the last several years. So this is not June of 2021, this is the month of June in general, and there's a slider there where you can say how many cycles back you want to look to see, you know, in June, in the last 2 years or in the last 3 years, who has been looking for fellows. Unlike other job notices on PSJD, we also are doing continuous outreach to organizations that have advertised with us in the past to try and learn what their plans are for the upcoming year. So if you're an organization that's advertised on PSJD, you might get an email from us that says, you know, around this time last year, you posted a notice looking for a fellow. We know these things usually are programs that recur within an organization, either every year or every other year. So we're just checking in with you to see if you know what your plans are for the upcoming cycle. And if you don't, when might be a good time for us to follow up with you again. So these notices are unique in our system in that we are putting in continual effort to keep them as up to date as we can and give you as broad and well-informed a basis as we can for you to prepare your fellowship search. And that's my spiel.
All right, thank you. That was very helpful. It's useful to see it on the screen and also just to see all of the options and how much is available there. So I think we have a few more minutes before we close out, and I wanted to turn to the question and answer box. Some of the questions have already been answered in writing, so definitely if you put a question in there, go back and see if it's been answered. But there's a few questions left. I wanted to ask anyone who would like to answer. For students who are partnered with a host organization that had a separate application process for a fellowship contingent on securing funding through EJW or Skadden, how would you suggest students create a backup plan in case they are not selected for EJW or Skadden? And that's always a hard question, right? If you're applying for a fellowship, you don't know if it'll come through, what kind of backup plans should you have in the works? And how do you sort of manage that between the different timelines that might exist? Maybe this is why no one answered this in the chat box, because it's a hard one. Like, I don't know, Jen, does Legal Aid have a policy as to whether you can apply for, whether if you're hosting someone as a fellowship applicant, they can also be applying for other jobs elsewhere or clerkships or?
I'm not aware of any like formal policy. I think we'd probably just have like a general expectation that once we make a commitment to each other on the fellowship, that we're going to see that process through and that we wouldn't lose our candidate in the middle of that because they got another job. But at the same time, I think that, if none of the fellowships work out, I think that we always want to think about whether there's a way we could still bring the person on. That's far from a guarantee. And I think it really depends on kind of the just financial position of the organization. I think that's the ideal, but I don't have any great answers to this other than acknowledging how hard it is to be kind of in a holding pattern for a long time, not knowing if it's going to work out in the end. And I guess the nice thing is knowing at least that the cohort, the cohort positions are posted on a rolling basis. I mean, right, like jobs, public interest jobs are posted on a rolling basis. So I do think that, in most cases where we have been successful in getting a fellowship, we have known more in that like November, December timeframe. And so while it never feels comfortable, it also does allow, some time to just keep looking for things that might pop up. We have staff attorney positions open basically all the time.
That was going to be my advice, is to check and see if a cohort fellowship opportunity is available in your area. And sometimes, if our host organizations are having a hard time finding someone to fill a position, we might even go and ask Chrissy's team, hey, do you have someone who applied in this area that didn't get a fellowship? So we're looking out for you on that side too.
Yeah, and I'll add there, our selection cycle wraps up, like I mentioned, in March, April, and then it reopens in May, June. So we often see folks that were not successful in their first application and selection cycle reapply. They remain that eligibility. They haven't filled any permanent full-time positions as a public interest attorney. And so apply again and tweak your application, make it more compelling, make it stand out. We want to hear from you next year too, if you're so passionate about this work and if it's still the right fit for you. We want to hear about it. And then too, another option that we see, and we communicate often with our candidates towards the end of the selection cycle in particular, they may be exploring with their law school what a bridge fellowship may look like, what that gap year may look like. And bridge fellowships do not preclude you from eligibility for Equal Justice Works participation in our program. So, explore all your options, cast a wide net. Just because you're not a fellow after your first application cycle does not mean that you're not going to have a very successful career as a public interest attorney. It just means that in this competitive cycle, it didn't work out. So.
Yeah, and the bridge fellowships, something we didn't talk about too much tonight, but those are fellowships that are sponsored by the law school, right? The law school that you attend might help you launch your career by sponsoring some amount of time at an organization after you graduate. All right, and then we have one last question. Well, we have a few, but let me see if I can get to these. Well, one person asked, what are the percentages of applications that actually get funded, that actually get fellowships? If you have those numbers, like how many people apply, how many people get it?
Great question for Skadden. You know, I heard that 26 number. I'm not sure how many folks applied, but it's a very competitive process that I think Sherry Ann can speak more at length to. For on the Design Your Own team or the Design Your Own side at Equal Justice Works, we receive 450 to 475 applications every cycle, and we are looking to fund between 70 and 80 fellows in the field. So classes range typically between 70 and 80. In 2020, we actually had 86 fellows in the field. So it can just kind of range too, based on our sponsors. So 1 in 7 is the number that we hear from, or that we stick to. But in that process, you know, Skadden is selecting 26 fellows. And so oftentimes folks will apply both to Skadden and Equal Justice Works. And so that means that they've gotten a fellowship offer for another place. And so that doesn't mean that 1 in 7 applicants has a fellowship. It means that 1 in 7 applicants is at Equal Justice Works.
And
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, Skadden does 28 each year. And I think I just read on their website that they normally get about 200 applications. So that's about 14%, I think. But they're pretty consistent, like every year is 28 on the nose. So depending, I'm sure some years they might get more than 200, so it might be a little bit more competitive, but that's the general like Skadden numbers.
But that's a great point that there is overlap between the 2 fellowship programs and the other fellowship programs. And there's lots of fellowship programs. And so, you know, some people may not be getting an EJW or a Skadden, but they might get something else, or they might not get a Skadden, but they do get an EJW, or however it may fall out. One other question I have here is someone who has a strong relationship with a small new organization that specializes in restorative justice diversion for young people. And the organization wants this person to join an application for a fellowship, but the organization doesn't have any attorneys on staff. So there's no legal supervision. Does that preclude them from being considered as a host organization? And if so, do you have any suggestions for an organization like this that's operating in sort of legal adjacent space?
This is a tough one because the short answer here is that this host organization is not eligible to host a fellow, right? So one of the very specific requirements and obligations of our host organizations is to provide adequate legal supervision to someone who is typically a first year or new attorney. And so I think Jen may have some thoughts on this as well, but my thoughts for organizations that are operating in the legal adjacent space, if they want to step into the legal space, is to create that capacity before they pursue a fellow in an innovative and discrete project space.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it may be that, I don't know, looking to see if there are any legal services organizations in the same community who might be interested in partnering with that legal adjacent organization and haven't done that yet. And just, you know, need to be presented with this opportunity. Maybe that could be another avenue to try. I do think that, like, you know, fellowship program requirements are not the idea of bringing a new lawyer on to any place that does not have any legal supervision is probably going to be a non-starter for reasons that are just, bar admission and being able to sort of do what you need to do as a lawyer. So maybe see if there are legal organizations that might partner.
Well, we're nearing the end of our program, but I want to give you all a chance to give any parting words of advice, if you have anything that we haven't covered in this series of questions, or anything that you just want, any last words you want to leave the participants with.
I'll just say that get involved now as much as you can. I really can't say enough about practical experience as you move into the legal world. And there's so many great opportunities out there for you as a law student, even outside of fellowships. So, try as many different areas now to get an idea of what you do like and what you don't like. Do pro bono work for a local legal aid organization, take an externship course at your law school. And Equal Justice Works has tons of opportunities for law students too, trainings, webinars, our career fair, and internship opportunities. So just check out what's out there and start now.
I think that's great, Linda. I'll plug quickly here that our law school engagement and advocacy team does host summer programming for law students. And so keep an eye on Equal Justice Works website. And so if this is something that you're interested in pursuing, again, keep an eye out, cast a wide net, pursue what you're interested in. I'll share, what I think about the public interest space is that it's more often than not, vocational calling as opposed to just like filling a job or filling a role for a short-term period of time. And so just reflecting on what's motivated you to pursue this career path will be really helpful for you as you're crafting that compelling application, because it should feel authentic to who you are and why you are pursuing the work. So giving that some thought during this time might help you as you're crafting that compelling application as well.
The only thing I can think of to add is really like, don't be discouraged. I think it's such a stressful time. I remember it. And I think as a public interest attorney or someone who wants to go the public interest route, it can be particularly difficult because you're surrounded by law firm people who know where they're going way ahead of time. And there's the people who have clerkships and they know where they're going way ahead of time. And fellowships is one of the only places in public interest where there's a way to know where you're going way ahead of time. But it's not the majority, I don't think, way that people get public interest jobs. It's one gateway. And so if it doesn't work out, you've invested all this time, it's not a waste, right? You put concreteness on your vision and you got yourself excited about something, that's going to give you great interviewing skills. It's going to give you great cover letter material to talk concretely when it gets closer to graduation time and you're looking for those rolling postings of like staff attorney positions, because you can't get those when you're, a 2L. The organization needs someone now. They need someone who's going to be able to take the bar, pass it, and start soon. So it's not that there won't be jobs. It's just that you're going to have to have that discomfort of getting kind of close, but they're there. Legal services and other public interest organizations, I think, are always needing to hire, and so just don't give up, despite all the stress of not knowing.
Yeah, and that's a ton of great advice. So I don't have a lot to add. One of the things that I do like to tell people though is talk to as many current and past fellows as possible. I know when I was considering applying, I spoke with an Equal Justice Works fellow and Skadden fellows, multiple people, especially in your project area. Because I know for at least Skadden, they only had a few fellows that were doing voting rights work. And so I think I connected with all 4 of them. So they can give me their tips on how to approach it, how to write the application. And as I mentioned, also being an advocate for you with the foundation and sending letters on your behalf. So as many connections as possible as you can make to give you advice. And I know some people feel differently about it, but some shared their applications with me so I could read like how they wrote their applications and what they said, how they crafted their work. So if you talk to people, you might even get that type of support. They'd be willing to help you do mock interviews. So really building connections with as many fellows as possible is my suggestion.
That's a great suggestion of the informational interview. As evidenced by our panelists tonight, public interest folks are willing to help and to share their knowledge. And so don't be afraid to ask for an informational interview. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your giving your time tonight and all of your insight. And I'll turn it over to Christina Jackson.
So a big thank you from us about your information, your insight, your concrete tips. I know this was a lot of information because applying for a fellowship is a big deal. So I will say 2 things in closing. One, your career development office, and I can pretty much guarantee no matter what school you're coming from, there is someone there with expertise, either in the career development office, in the clinical faculty, maybe even on the tenured faculty. You're going to want to plan ahead. You're going to want to think through how you're going to approach the application process. Unlike any other public interest job, this takes a lot of long-term planning, and your career development office will be able to help you every single step of the way. They are experts at how to do this. Most of them have had fellows in the past, can review the applications for you, do the mock interviews, do all of that. So take advantage of them. The second thing I will say is funders want to fund. Fellowships want to get fellows. This is a very competitive process, but is an inclusive process. We want you to get fellowships if you want a fellowship. So take advantage of every opportunity to ask the program coordinators questions, talk with the folks at Skadden, talk with the fellows. The more people you're connecting with, the better chance you have of getting that application come to fruition in a fellowship. We are going to send a follow-up email along with this recording early next week. It will include the resources that we talked about today, but I will also include some additional resources. I'll make clear what the deadlines are. I will give you a link to the EJW informational sessions that you really need to go to if you want to apply. Skadden does similar informational sessions, and I will provide any scheduled, if they have any scheduled, I'll provide that information for you as well in the follow-up. The last thing I will say is, both for our panel and for myself, if we can help you in this fellowship process, please let us know. We want you to be successful. We want more passionate advocates for justice. And if we can help you be that next advocate, we are happy to do so. Thank you so much, panel, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.